The first strange thing was the core sample. Not the vibrations, not what happened to Gerald, not the sound I heard rising through the floor of the access room on the last night. The core sample was the first thing, pulled from 400 meters below the surface of northeastern British Columbia, containing something that had no business being inside 4,000-year-old rock. If any of us had known then how to read what it was telling us, 6 men might have walked out of that camp at the end of their contract instead of 3. My name is Roy Pierce. What I am about to tell you was recorded in the spring of 1974 in a kitchen in Prince George, British Columbia, by a journalist named Mrs. Helen Rourke of the Vancouver province, who found my name in a sealed insurance claim filed by the Athabasca Copper Company in February of 1962. She is the third person to ask me about Camp 7 in 13 years, and the first I agreed to speak to, because the previous 2 were working for the company, and what they wanted was not information. What Mrs. Rourke wants is a record. I have no objection to a record. I will tell you about Camp 7 in the order things happened, because that is the only way I know how to make a person understand why we did what we did. It is easy, looking back from the outside, to wonder why no one acted differently at various moments. I wonder that myself. What I have come to understand is that each decision made sense at the time based on what we knew, and that what we knew at each moment was always exactly 1 step behind what was actually happening to us. That gap of 1 step is what I want to explain. I was 34 years old in the autumn of 1961. I had been a contract driller since I was 19, which meant 15 years underground across 6 provinces. I had worked in hard rock and soft rock and ground that did not behave like either. I had worked in mines that smelled of copper and mines that smelled of sulfur, and one mine in northern Quebec that had no smell at all, which the older men said was a bad sign. They were right. That site flooded in under 2 weeks. My particular skill was reading the sounds a mine makes, the way rock shifts and resettles, the way water moves through a seam, the difference between the sound of a tunnel breathing and the sound of a tunnel under stress. This is not something you are told. It is something you accumulate over years of paying attention when you are underground, and your life depends on what you hear. I mention this because I want you to understand what kind of witness I am. I am not a man inclined toward imagination in professional settings. I am a man who has spent 15 years underground, distinguishing between what belongs to a mine and what does not. What I encountered at Camp 7 did not belong. I knew this before I had language for it, and what I am giving you now is my attempt to set down in order the sequence of things that led to that knowledge. The Athabasca Copper Company's Camp 7 was established on a cleared plateau approximately 53 kilometers north of Fort Nelson in northeastern British Columbia. Fort Nelson is not a large town. In 1961, it was accessible primarily by a road that held for heavy trucks about 7 months of the year, and by snowmobile or aircraft for the remainder. The drilling site had been selected because a preliminary survey in the spring of 1961 identified a promising copper vein in the basalt below the plateau, running at an estimated depth of 180 to 220 meters. The company wanted to know how deep the vein went and how much copper it contained, and for that they needed a deep drilling operation with a crew capable of sustained work through the winter. The camp itself was functional and nothing more. 6 prefabricated structures moved in over the summer, 2 bunkhouses that slept 4 men each, a cookhouse with a combined generator room, a supply shed, a geologist's hut, and the shaft housing. The shaft housing was the largest structure, a corrugated steel and timber frame building, approximately 12 meters by 8 meters, built directly over the primary drill site. The generator ran on diesel and provided power to all structures through a cable system strung on wooden poles between the buildings. There was a radio in the cookhouse for communication with the company's Fort Nelson office. There was a road of sorts connecting the camp to the main supply route, passable to snowmobiles and to the company's supply truck, which made the run approximately every 8 to 10 days. The surrounding landscape was black spruce boreal, the kind of forest that does not open up or allow light even in summer. By mid-October, when my crew arrived, the light was gone well before 5 in the afternoon, and the temperature was sitting at -22 by day. The plateau had been cleared to create the camp footprint, but the forest pressed in on 3 sides within 20 meters of the outermost buildings, and the 4th side was a rock face, approximately 30 meters high, that blocked the prevailing northern wind. The camp therefore sat in a cold pocket, where the air was still even when the surrounding trees moved. I noticed on the first day that the camp was quiet in a way that was different from camps I had worked before. Every northern camp I have been in has its ambient wildlife, whiskey jacks, grey jays, ravens working the edges of the clearing, camp followers. They are reliable enough that experienced crews treat their absence as a signal. At Camp 7 there were no birds. There were no sounds from the forest that I could attribute to any animal. The only sounds were the diesel generator and the crunch of boots on frozen ground, and our own voices. I mentioned this to Vince Callan on the first evening. He had noticed it too. He said it was probably because we were in dense enough cover that most wildlife had already moved south. He said it in the tone of a man who is trying to convince himself rather than the other person. I let it rest. There was no productive alternative on day 1. The crew. Vince Callan was 51 years old that autumn. He had started underground in the Cape Breton coal mines as a young man and had worked his way west over 30 years, picking up hard rock credentials along the way. He was not a large man, but he was a dense one, with the kind of muscular economy that comes from a lifetime of physical work in confined spaces. He did not talk much on the job, but when he talked off it, he talked at considerable length and with considerable specificity. And his opinions on Athabasca Copper's management decisions were not endorsements. He had taken this contract because the pay was good, and because he had been between jobs since August and had a daughter in school in Kamloops whose tuition he was covering. Vince was skeptical by professional temperament. He did not believe things without evidence, and when evidence arrived, he examined it carefully before concluding anything. I respected this about him. Later, when Vince began pressing us to leave Camp 7, I thought about this characteristic and concluded that if Vince Callan was frightened by something, the thing in question was genuinely frightening. Tommy Egan was 26 and on his 3rd contract since completing his drilling certification. He was from Sault Ste. Marie originally, and he had the particular quality of young workers who are technically excellent before experience has fully installed the caution that accompanies that excellence. He was good inside a drill cab. He had good hands and good ears, and he could read what the rock was doing through the controls in a way that takes most drillers years to develop. He was also the kind of person who fills a space with energy, who makes a camp feel occupied rather than merely staffed. When Tommy was present in the cookhouse at a meal, the conversation was different than when he was not. I mention this because later, when he was not there, the silence in the cookhouse was a particular kind of silence. The foreman was Gerald Mackay. I have told you something about him already, and I want to add one specific thing, because it becomes important before this account is finished. Gerald had a habit that every crew he ever ran came to rely on. When he finished an inspection of a tunnel section, he was always the last man to leave. Always. He checked each man out before he followed. He had done this for so long it was automatic, and his men came to expect it as a guarantee. Nobody left a Gerald Mackay tunnel without Gerald having confirmed you were clear. I had worked under him twice before, and I had noted this habit and found it admirable. By the last night at Camp 7, I had a different feeling about it. Dr. Peter Ashford was the company geologist assigned to the site. He was 43, his doctorate from Queen's, 4 years with Athabasca Copper, following a decade in university research. He was not what I would call an outdoorsman. He dressed adequately for the cold but moved through it carefully, as though the environment were an obstacle to his work rather than a component of it. He kept meticulous records in a system of labeled folders that he organized and reorganized each evening in his hut. I did not dislike Ashford. I found him efficient and honest in his assessments. What I found difficult was his certainty, which was not the earned certainty of someone who has tested beliefs against difficult conditions, but the inherited certainty of someone who has always worked in environments where their expertise is the primary tool. By the end of our time at Camp 7, that certainty was gone. He was emptied of it. I have thought about whether that was a loss or a correction. In addition to Vince, Tommy, Gerald, Ashford, and myself, the camp included 2 crew hands who had been at the site since August. I will call them Harris and Dubois. They handled equipment and assisted with rigging, and performed whatever tasks the foreman assigned. They had seen the camp in its earlier stages, and knew the site and its quirks. I will come back to them. The work and the sounds. The first week of deep drilling was the kind of hard routine that settles a crew into its own rhythms. You get up before light, you eat, you go underground, and for the first few days the sounds of the drill and the rock and your own labor are the whole world. After a few days, these sounds become so familiar they stop registering as individual things and become a kind of texture, a background against which anything unusual will stand out immediately. The sounds of drilling at depth are specific, and I want to describe them carefully. The bit rotation produces a continuous, low-pitched grinding that transmits through the drill string, through the drive head, through the housing frame, and into the rock walls of the tunnel. It is felt as much as heard, a vibration that enters through the soles of your boots and travels up through your legs and settles in your chest as a kind of pressure. The hydraulic systems of the drive unit produce a higher-pitched cycling sound, a rhythmic hiss and clunk of pressure, applied and released. Water flush used in the drilling produces a constant rushing sound in the drill rod. The cores coming up produce a muffled change in the bit's tone as it transitions between rock types, a slightly different pitch when it crosses a seam or finds a pocket. In addition to these operational sounds, a tunnel at depth has its own sounds. Water seeping through cracks produces a variety of drips and trickles that change with temperature and pressure. Rock under stress settles and shifts, producing sounds ranging from faint ticks to occasional sharp cracks, all of which are normal and none of which indicate instability unless they cluster or increase. The heating and cooling of surface structures produces sounds that transmit down into the upper sections of the shaft, particularly with a generator running on a cold night. These are the sounds I had spent 15 years cataloging. I could identify each of them and locate their source and tell you whether they were consistent with normal operating conditions. On the second morning, during a break in the drilling, I heard something I could not identify. The drill had been shut down for a bit inspection. The tunnel at the 180-meter level was quiet. The sounds I expected in that silence were the distant generator, the drip of groundwater in the lower section, the occasional tick of rock resettling. What I heard was additional to these, a low resonance, coming from below rather than from any identifiable point in the tunnel, continuous for approximately 10 seconds, and then absent. Not loud, not alarming by itself, but it did not match any source I could account for. I catalogued it and returned to the support check. Over the following 6 days, I heard this resonance 3 more times, always during periods when the drill was not running. It was consistent in pitch and character each time. I formed the hypothesis that it was a geological phenomenon. Certain rock formations under certain temperature and pressure conditions can produce low-frequency resonances caused by gas movement through porous material or by differential thermal expansion of adjacent rock types. I had never personally encountered such a phenomenon in exactly this form, but I was aware of accounts of similar sounds from other deep drilling sites. I was not troubled by it. Vince mentioned it to me on the 5th morning, without my having prompted him. He said he had heard something he could not attribute, and asked if I had too. I told him my hypothesis. He considered it, and said he thought I was probably right. He said it in the tone of a man who is not certain he thinks anything is right. Harris said he had heard it once, early on the 4th day, and had not mentioned it because he did not know what to make of it. Dubois said nothing. Tommy had not heard it, which I later understood was because his cab position in the drive unit put him closest to the operational sounds and likely masked lower frequency inputs that were more perceptible farther from the equipment. At no point during this first week Did the resonance strike me as evidence of anything other than an unusual geological condition? I want to be clear about this, because I know there is a temptation to read significance back into the beginning of an account when you know how the account ends. We did not know at the time. We knew what we knew when we knew it. The void and the core sample. On the 9th day, at 412 meters depth, the drill bit dropped. This event has a specific sound I can describe exactly. The rotation pitch of the bit rises slightly as contact resistance drops. Then there is a brief period of freefall registering as a sudden absence of torque feedback in the drive system. Then the bit catches the far wall of the void, and the pitch returns to normal within a fraction of a second. The whole event takes less than 2 seconds. Tommy had the drive shut down within 3 seconds of the bit catching. We pulled the string to inspect the bit, undamaged. No unusual scoring, no metal fatigue at the tips, nothing indicating it had encountered anything harder or softer than the surrounding basalt. This was what I expected. A void in that geology is not unusual and would not damage a bit at our operating RPM. Ashford came in from his hut when we cut the drive, which meant he had been monitoring our operational sounds from outside, which was not unusual for him. Ashford examined the bit and agreed it was undamaged. He asked for the depth log for the void. Gerald made the entry himself and read it back. 412 meters. Estimated void depth 60 centimeters. Bit undamaged. Contact with far side confirmed. No evidence of lateral extension. Ashford said voids at that depth were not remarkable and could be caused by a gas pocket, a dissolution cavity in the rock matrix, or a pre-existing fracture system. He said we should log the void and continue drilling into the far side to assess rock quality below it. We pulled the core from the run that had ended at the upper edge of the void before we continued. Standard procedure. You examine what you pulled before you drill further. Tommy extracted the core barrel and handed it to Ashford, who set it on his examination board and began the standard process of cracking the barrel and extracting the sections. The last section of the core was where the object was. Ashford laid the core sections on his board in sequence. He narrated the mineral content as he went, which was his habit. Basalt, copper mineralization at this section, quartz intrusion here, returning to basalt. He was halfway through this narration when he stopped. He did not say anything for a moment. He leaned closer to the board. He turned the last core section in his hands. I was standing about 4 feet from him. I saw what he saw. The object was approximately 22 centimeters long. It was curved, tapering at one end to a point and widening at the other into what appeared to be a fractured base, as though the wider end had been separated from a larger structure by force rather than by cutting. The color was a deep amber brown with darker striations along its length. The surface was smooth and dense, neither porous nor reflective. At the fractured base, the cross-section showed an internal structure, a cortical exterior, dense and hard, surrounding a core material that was lighter in color and appeared finely laminated in a way I associated with organic growth rather than mineral deposition. It was bone, or something sufficiently similar to bone that the distinction required laboratory equipment to determine. I have held a great deal of core samples in 15 years. I know what mineral inclusion in rock looks like. I know what fossilized plant material looks like, because it appears regularly in sedimentary cores and has a specific texture and internal structure that I can recognize. This was not either of those things. This had the internal structure of an organic material that had retained its original architecture within the matrix of the surrounding rock. The specific organic material it resembled was the dense bone or horn of a large animal, and it was curved in a way that suggested a specific geometry. The taper, the inner face of the curve, the way the wide end had fractured clean. I did not say the word at the time, but the word that occurred to me was claw. Nobody spoke for approximately 10 seconds after Ashford picked it up. Then Ashford began talking. He said the color was consistent with silicification of organic material under pressure. He said the internal lamination could be explained by differential mineral replacement during fossilization. He said that under sufficient burial conditions, plant root structures could develop a dense cortex that resembled bone. He said these things quickly, in the measured tone of his professional assessments, but he said them at a pace I associate with a person who is covering the distance between themselves and something that has alarmed them. Vince, standing to my right, said, "That is not a plant root." Ashford said he would need to examine it in his hut. Gerald watched Ashford carry the object to the geologist's hut. Then he turned to us and said we should resume drilling. He wrote something in his notebook. I watched him write. He wrote for longer than a short log entry requires. That evening, Ashford came to the cookhouse at supper and said he would need laboratory analysis before making any assessment. He said this carefully. Gerald asked him to lock the object in his equipment chest until the next supply run, 8 days away. Ashford agreed. Gerald made another entry in his notebook. Tommy asked me privately, when Ashford had left, whether I thought it was what he thought it was. I asked him what he thought it was. He did not answer directly. He said it was the largest curved thing he had ever seen come out of a drill core, and that the curve went in a specific direction, and that the direction made him think of something specific. He did not say what. I told him to finish his meal. That was the 9th day. I did not know then that the object would never reach any laboratory. The vibrations begin. I woke at some point after midnight on the 10th night. My first thought was that there was a problem with the generator. The bunkhouse floor was vibrating. Not rattling, not shaking. A pulse, low and rhythmic, felt through the mattress and through the soles of my feet when I stood. One pulse, roughly every 4 to 5 seconds. Even, measured. The closest comparison I can give is the feeling of standing near a large diesel engine at idle, but slower and more regular than any engine I have operated or stood near, and without the accompanying noise above it. I went to the door and listened. The generator was running normally. Its sound is continuous and higher in pitch than what I was feeling. What I was feeling was something else entirely. I stood in the doorway for a few minutes, feeling the pulse through the wooden floor, and then I went back to sleep because there was no other useful thing to do at that hour. In the morning I told Vince. He had been awake too. He had done the same thing I had, checked the generator, confirmed the pulse was not a lateral surface transmission, confirmed it was coming from below rather than from any direction on the same level. He had not woken anyone because, like me, he did not know what to say about it. We told Gerald at breakfast. Gerald spent 20 minutes with Vince examining the generator. He came back and said the generator was running within all normal parameters and that no vibration consistent with what we described was attributable to it. He said he would monitor the situation and asked us to report any recurrence. The pulse was present the following night and the night after that. By the 4th night of the pulse, Vince had started a small notebook of his own, recording the timing. He showed it to me on the 5th morning. The pulse started between 10:15 and 10:40 each night, ran for roughly 4.5 hours, and stopped between 2:45 and 3:15. The intervals between individual pulses ranged from 4 to 5.2 seconds, with no consistent pattern in the variation. In Vince's handwriting, it looked like a seismic record, which is roughly what it was. He said, "This is not geological." I said I did not want to speculate without more information. He said, "Roy, 4 seconds, every 4 seconds, night after night. No geological process makes a sound that regular." I said there were processes I was not personally aware of, and that I wanted more information before drawing conclusions. Vince looked at me for a moment. Then he put the notebook back in his jacket and said nothing more about it that morning. But we both knew what the other knew. A geological process does not pulse at 4-second intervals for 4.5 hours and then stop. A geological process does not resume the following night at the same time. What does, that is something that sleeps in the day. Ashford, when Gerald raised the vibration issue with him, said he had not personally noticed it. I believe he was telling the truth. He was sleeping in the geologist's hut, the structure farthest from the main shaft, and the pulse may have been less perceptible there, or Ashford's sleep at that time was heavier than ours. By the time the pulse became perceptible to Ashford, it was no longer subtle enough to require proximity. The evidence in the tunnels. On the morning of the 12th day, Gerald found the tool cache in Tunnel B disturbed. Tunnel B was a secondary branch at the 150-meter level, running perpendicular to the main shaft for 32 meters before ending in an unextended face. The crew had been working primarily in the main shaft for the past week, and Tunnel B had not been accessed in 4 days. The cache at the far end held spare drill bits, a case of rock bolts, several wrenches and adjustment tools, and 2 full fuel containers for the secondary lighting system. The cache was secured with a padlock. Gerald had the only key. The padlock had been opened and refastened. The interior of the cache had been rearranged. The case of rock bolts had been placed on the floor, upside down, approximately 3 meters from where it had been stored. 6 of the drill bits had been removed from their rack and laid on the floor in a row, each bit separated from the next by approximately the same distance. Not scattered, arranged. Gerald showed Vince and me before he showed anyone else. He asked us whether we had any explanation. I said I did not. Vince said the padlock ruled out anyone from the crew, and that the deliberate arrangement of the bits ruled out casual disturbance, and that he had no explanation for either fact that he was comfortable offering. Gerald photographed the cache with the company camera. He had a particular stillness when he was working through something difficult, a quality different from ordinary calm, and he was in that state while he photographed what he had found. Then he restored the cache contents, resecured the padlock, and told us he was going to extend the next inspection cycle for all tunnel sections. 2 days later, the support timbers in the lower section of the main shaft showed damage I want to describe precisely, because the nature of the damage matters. 6-inch support timbers are set into drilled housings in the rock wall at regular intervals along a tunnel section. They are placed to bear against lateral rock pressure. They are set plumb, and they are tight in their housings. Removing or displacing them requires significant force applied in a specific direction. 3 of the timbers in the lower main shaft, at the 300-meter level, were no longer plumb. They had been displaced inward into the tunnel space, angled at roughly 20 degrees from vertical. They were not loose in their housings. They had been pushed inward from behind the wall at a point above their base by a force applied from the exterior of the rock face into the tunnel interior. Ashford's response to this was to offer settling as an explanation. Gerald asked him to model a settling event that would produce inward displacement of 3 non-adjacent timbers at equal angles without affecting the intermediate timbers. Ashford said he would need to think about that. Then Gerald asked whether freeze-thaw cycles could produce this kind of displacement at 300 meters depth. Ashford said the freeze-thaw cycle at that depth was negligible. Then he said the rock quality in the area might be relevant. Then he was quiet for a long time. That afternoon, Harris and Dubois packed their gear. I spoke to Harris in the yard as he loaded his bag into the supply truck that had arrived with a diesel delivery. He was a careful man, reserved, the kind of worker who does his job without creating friction or commentary. He had been in camp since his mid-20s and he was now in his late 30s, and when he spoke he gave you the sense that he was offering a selected portion of what he thought and retaining the rest. I asked him why he was leaving. He looked at me for a moment. Then he said, "There is something wrong here. Not the rock, not the equipment. Something wrong with the place itself." He looked at the shaft housing. Then he looked back at me and said, "You should come." I said I had a contract. He said, "Yes." He picked up his bag and got into the truck. Dubois shook hands with the staying crew and got in without a word. The truck left at 2:30 in the afternoon. 5 men remaining: Gerald, Vince, Tommy, Ashford, myself. Gerald called a crew meeting that evening. He said he did not know what had disturbed the cache or displaced the timbers. He intended to find out. Anyone who felt strongly about leaving could speak to the company representative on the next supply run, 6 days out. The company was counting on the team to complete the copper vein assessment. Safety was his first priority, and conditions would continue to be monitored. Nobody said they were leaving. Vince looked at the table through most of the meeting. Tommy asked whether Gerald thought the cache and the timbers were connected. Gerald said he did not yet know. He wrote in his notebook, Tommy. On the morning of the 14th day, Tommy Egan did not come back from Tunnel B. He had gone to retrieve a measurement log left at the 30-meter mark on the previous shift, a 5-minute task at most. When he had not returned in 30 minutes, I went to check. The tunnel was empty. His lamp was on the floor at the 20-meter mark, still lit. The measurement log was on the ground beside it, as though it had been set down carefully rather than dropped. There was no sign of Tommy beyond these two items. No damage to the tunnel walls or floor, no indication of any fall or struggle, no breach of any kind. I stood at the point where the lamp sat, and I listened to that tunnel in the way I have listened to tunnels for 15 years, and I heard something. From below the floor of Tunnel B, which is a slab of basalt over whatever exists beneath it, I heard the sound of breathing. I will describe it as carefully as I can, and I will not reach for dramatic language, because the plain description is strange enough. It was slow and deep and resonant, the kind of breath produced by a chest cavity considerably larger than anything I had worked alongside. It lasted approximately 10 seconds. During those 10 seconds I did not move, and I did not breathe. Then the sound stopped. Then I went back to the surface. I told Gerald what I had found. I told him about the lamp and the log first. He went down and confirmed both. Then I told him about the sound. He listened to my description without interrupting. He wrote it in his notebook. The search of all accessible tunnel sections that day found no sign of Tommy. The radio message to the company produced the response I have already described, a search team in 6 days. Gerald's counter-message stated the situation was urgent. The company's response was to ask for more detail before resources could be expedited. Gerald did not respond to the third message that day. That evening, Vince said clearly, "We are leaving." Gerald said he would not leave without knowing what had happened to Tommy. Vince said that Tommy was gone, and that the question of what had happened to him was a question for a properly equipped search team, not for 5 men in a mining camp with something moving in their tunnels. Gerald said, 4 of us. Meaning there were 4 of us, because Tommy made 5 and Tommy was gone. Vince was quiet for a moment. Then he said we should leave. Gerald said he would not. That was the end of that conversation, and both men understood it. Ashford and the lower tunnels. The following morning, before Gerald and I went underground, Ashford came to the cookhouse and said he needed to speak to Gerald. He said he had been re-examining the core sample for 3 days. He said he had used every assessment method available to him in a field setting. He said the object was not a mineralized plant root. He said the internal structure was consistent with the horn or claw material of a large animal, specifically the dense cortical architecture of a rapidly growing structure designed to bear significant mechanical loads. He said the geometry of the curve and the taper was consistent with a grasping or digging appendage at a scale he could not attribute to any known contemporary Canadian fauna. He said the position in the 4,000-year-old stratigraphy was unambiguous. The object was as old as the rock that contained it. He said all of this quietly and carefully, and without the certainty he normally brought to his assessments, because the certainty was gone. He was telling us what the evidence said. He was not telling us he knew what it meant. Vince asked what kind of animal leaves something that large in basalt. Ashford said he did not know. Gerald asked whether the void at 412 meters was consistent with a naturally occurring cavity or with something excavated from below over time. Ashford was quiet for a long time. Then he said that the shape of the void, as far as he could assess from the drill data, was not consistent with a naturally occurring dissolution cavity. He said it was consistent with a cavity enlarged from below over a long period. Gerald wrote this in his notebook. Gerald and I went into the lower tunnels that morning. I will tell you what we found. At the 380-meter level, there was a mark on the north wall of the main shaft that had not been there during my last inspection. A horizontal line scored into the basalt, running continuously for roughly 3 meters. The line was approximately 2 meters above the tunnel floor. It was not cut with any tool I recognized. It had been scored, traced along the wall, by something with a hard, narrow edge moving at that height and applying considerable pressure. The basalt at that section rates at roughly 200 megapascals compressive strength. Something had marked it without difficulty. Gerald photographed the mark. I saw him measure from the floor to the mark with the tape he had brought. He measured twice, 2 meters above the floor. At that height, relative to the tunnel cross-section, the mark had been made by something moving through the tunnel at that elevation, something at minimum 2 meters tall in its normal posture within a tunnel passage. At the 400-meter level, near the steel plate we had bolted over the void, we found rock fragments gathered in the corner of the lateral extension. Not rubble from drilling. The fragments were angular, broken from the wall rather than cut from it. They were gathered rather than scattered, in the way that an animal gathers debris in a den. No drill crew had arranged them. Gerald was crouching to examine these fragments when his lamp flickered. Mine did not. His flickered in a rhythm. 4 seconds. Then 5. Then 4. We left the lower tunnels. We walked from the 400-meter level to the surface, at a pace that neither of us described afterward as running, but which covered the distance in approximately half the usual time. At the 200-meter level, Gerald paused and listened. In the silence of the non-running drill, with no operational sounds to cover anything, I heard the low resonance again, clearer than I had heard it in the secondary tunnels. Not a single tone, but multiple harmonics layered together, the way a large chamber amplifies a fundamental and produces overtones. It lasted 15 seconds. Then Gerald walked and I followed. At the surface, Gerald said, "Something is living in those tunnels." I said, "Below the void or above it?" He said, "I think above it now." The pulse changes. Over the next 2 nights, the vibrations changed in ways that Vince had been precise enough to document. On the 15th night, the interval shortened. From 4 to 5 seconds per pulse to 2 to 3 seconds. Vince woke me to confirm it. We sat in the bunkhouse in our jackets and counted pulses for 20 minutes. He was certain the interval had shortened. He said, "It is closer, or more active. Either way, something has changed." On the 16th night, the pulse ran from approximately 10 in the evening to 2 in the morning at the shorter interval, and for a period of approximately 40 minutes around midnight, the rhythm doubled, 2 pulses per second, a sustained doubling that made the bunkhouse floor vibrate at a frequency I could feel in my chest. It lasted 40 minutes and then returned to the shorter interval. During those 40 minutes, I heard something I had not heard from the bunkhouse before. The low resonance, coming up through the permafrost, filling the low frequencies of the bunkhouse interior. Not loud in the conventional sense, felt in your skeleton before you hear it with your ears. Vince heard it too. He said nothing. We sat and listened until it stopped. Gerald, when we reported this at breakfast, did not write in his notebook for a long time after we finished. Then he wrote for about 5 minutes without pausing, and when he was done, he put the notebook in his breast pocket and kept it there. The final plan. On the evening of the 16th day, Gerald called the final crew meeting. He said he had concluded the site was unsafe for continued operations. He believed the lower tunnel sections, specifically everything below the 150-meter level, contained a hazard beyond the crew's capacity to assess or address. He intended to seal the blast doors on the lower access tunnel, closing off the lower shaft system. Once the doors were sealed, the crew would depart for the road, and he would recommend that the company suspend operations pending an independent assessment. He said the blast door sealing mechanism required one person to operate a sequence of valves and controls in the access room over a period of approximately 15 minutes, after which that person would exit through the secondary ventilation shaft, which emerged approximately 200 meters east of the main camp at surface level. He said he would operate the mechanism himself. Vince said, "Gerald, come out with the rest of us. Leave the doors." Gerald said he was not willing to leave the lower tunnels accessible from the surface without barriers in place. Vince said, "Whatever you are worried about is already in the upper tunnels. We heard it through our bunk floors last night. You do not know that sealing the doors will help. Gerald said he was not certain sealing them would help, but he was certain not sealing them would not. He said, "The blast doors are rated for significant pressure from below. If something in those tunnels decides to move upward, a sealed door gives us more than an open one." Vince looked at him for a long time. Then he said, "Let one of us operate the controls. You come out with the crew." Gerald said, "I will be out through the ventilation shaft inside 20 minutes. I know the route." Ashford said he had something to add. He said he was not leaving without the core sample. He had been carrying it in his jacket pocket for 2 days by then. He said it was the only physical evidence they had of what was in those tunnels, and that if it reached the right people, someone might be able to determine what they were dealing with. Gerald said that was fine. The plan, at first light, Gerald to the access room to begin the sealing sequence. The rest of us to load the snowmobiles and be ready at the eastern rally point. When Gerald emerged from the ventilation shaft, we would leave together for the road. Vince did not agree with this plan. He told me so privately in the bunkhouse after the meeting. He said, "Gerald has a habit. You know the habit. He is going to be the last man out of that tunnel, and I am asking you to think about what that means in this particular tunnel, on this particular night." I thought about it. I did not have an answer that helped either of us. The attack. We did not make it to first light. At approximately 2:15 in the morning, the shaft housing was struck from below. I say struck because I know of no better word. Whatever happened to that steel and concrete structure over the main drill site happened as a single upward event, a concussive force transmitted through the foundation into the permafrost, which we felt in both bunkhouses as a shockwave moving through the floor, through the bunk frames, through the walls. It was not subtle. The coffee mug on my shelf was on the floor when I reached for it. The sound of the impact arrived a fraction of a second after the shockwave, a deep resonant crack, followed by the sound of steel under extreme load, a sustained groaning and tearing of the corrugated metal sheeting on the shaft housing's eastern wall. I was dressed and at the bunkhouse door in under 30 seconds. The temperature was -33. The sky was dark and perfectly clear and full of stars. In the ambient light, I could see that the eastern wall of the shaft housing was deformed. The sheet metal panels had separated along 2 seams, and the roofline on the eastern side had dropped approximately 1 meter. The vibration underfoot had changed again. It was no longer pulsed. The ground was vibrating continuously, a sustained building pressure without a rhythm, like the feeling before a very large machine comes to full operating speed, but without any sound above it to account for it. The vibration was below us and ascending. Then the second event occurred. Not another upward impact. This came from within the shaft housing. The sound of something large moving through an enclosed space, moving laterally through the housing's interior. Not metal. Not stone. Something displacing air at volume, the way a large animal displaces air in a space that is not quite large enough for it. The sound lasted approximately 4 seconds and ended with an impact against the western wall of the shaft housing that buckled the wall outward at mid-height. Gerald was already outside when I reached him. He had the company flashlight. He assessed the shaft housing in approximately 10 seconds. Then he turned toward the lower tunnel access room. I followed him. The access room. The access room is a reinforced concrete structure at surface level, directly above the upper shaft section. The blast door controls are on the north wall, 4 valve wheels and a lever assembly that must be operated in a specific sequence to engage the door sealing mechanism. Gerald went to the north wall and began. I stood at the entry. What I heard from below the access room floor I will describe exactly. In the first 2 minutes, the continuous vibration I have described, consistent through the concrete floor beneath my boots. In the 3rd minute, a change in the character of the sound from below. The sustained vibration shifted to something more complex, more varied. The sound of something moving through the upper sections of the tunnel system. Weight distributed across a large surface area, moving with deliberateness through confined rock. In the 5th minute, an impact against the tunnel wall below us, not against the access room floor, against the tunnel wall at what I estimated was the 100-meter level. One impact, heavy, brief, followed by a period of silence, and then the sound of movement continuing. In the 7th minute, 2 more impacts, one at a depth lower than the first, one at a depth I could not clearly determine because by that point, the resonance was filling the rock around us, and I could no longer isolate direction. And then, in the 7th minute, between the 2nd and 3rd impact, I heard the vocalization. It came from below and it came from everywhere simultaneously. The walls, the floor, the ceiling, because the rock was conducting it through every surface at once. It was not a roar. It was not a cry. It was a sound made by a throat of extraordinary size, producing a tone in the frequency range you feel rather than hear. And it lasted 4 seconds, and during those 4 seconds, every surface in the access room was vibrating at a frequency I felt in my skull, in my back teeth, in my sternum. Then it stopped. Gerald turned from the valve wheel and looked at me. He had been working the ceiling sequence for 7 minutes. He said, "Roy, go." I said his name. He said, "I have 8 minutes left. You cannot help me here. Go now." I stood in the doorway of the access room, and I looked at Gerald Mackay, who was 53 years old, and who had been going underground since before I was born, who had a notebook in his breast pocket with everything we had observed written down in pencil, who was standing at a valve wheel in a concrete room with something enormous moving through the rock below him. And I left. I want to be honest about this. I left because he told me to. I left because I had spent 20 years following the orders of foremen whose judgment I trusted, and because in that moment I could not find a more useful thing to do than obey. Whether that was good judgment or something less than good judgment I have turned over many times in the 13 years since. I go over it. The escape. The eastern ventilation tunnel is 200 meters long, 5 feet across, with a string of lights on a separate circuit. The lights were on when I reached the entry. Vince was already inside, moving. Ashford was behind him, moving quickly, the core sample in his jacket pocket. I told Vince that Gerald was at the controls. Vince said nothing and kept moving. We moved through the ventilation tunnel at what I would call a controlled run. The vibration in the tunnel walls was sustained and consistent, a pressure without a clear source direction. At the halfway point, there was an impact somewhere below and behind us, heavy enough to crack the concrete wall of the tunnel at one seam, a diagonal crack running from floor to approximately waist height. Dust came from it. We kept moving. The exit is a steel hatch set into a slope 200 meters east, and slightly above the main camp. Vince hit it with his shoulder, and it opened, and we came out into the dark and the cold. -33. No wind at that location, but no shelter either. We could see the shaft housing from where we stood. The eastern wall was collapsed inward at the base. The roofline on that side had come down at a steep angle, and the entire structure was visibly listing. The security lights on the bunkhouses and cookhouse were still running, small and steady in the dark. We stood and watched the camp, and watched the ventilation shaft opening for Gerald. I counted. I know I counted, because I remember the number clearly when Vince finally said we needed to move. 23 minutes. Gerald did not emerge from the ventilation shaft. Vince said we needed to go. I said we needed to wait. Vince said that without proper gear, Ashford would not survive the snowmobile ride to the road in -33, and that Ashford was shaking where he stood, and that he was right. Going back to the bunkhouses for gear meant crossing the camp yard past what had deformed the shaft housing. We went back through the ventilation tunnel. We retrieved cold weather gear from the equipment locker at the tunnel end. I leaned into the ventilation shaft opening and called Gerald's name 3 times. On the 3rd call, the vibration returned to the floor beneath my feet, not the sustained pressure of before, but the original pulse. 4 seconds, regular, rising from somewhere deep. I stepped away from the shaft and did not call again. We reached the snowmobiles and departed at approximately 4:15 in the morning. The trail through the boreal to the main road was 22 kilometers. We made it in under 2 hours in the dark. the headlights cutting through black spruce, and the frost crystals suspended in the air, catching light and falling behind us as we rode. I did not look back more than once. The camp was visible for perhaps 4 minutes as we cleared the plateau, a cluster of small lights in the dark above the tree line. Then the trees closed in and it was gone. I told myself I would come back for Gerald once we reached the road and contacted the company and arranged a proper search. I told myself this as we rode south through the cold with the spruce on either side of us, absolutely still and absolutely silent in the dark before dawn. Aftermath. The company sent a recovery team to Camp 7 6 days later. They found the shaft housing collapsed. They found the blast doors sealed. Gerald completed his work. They found no evidence of Gerald in the ventilation shaft or in any accessible section of the camp. They found his notebook on the floor of the access room, which was intact and undamaged. I was told this by the company representative who called me in Fort Nelson. I asked to read the notebook. I was told the notebook was a company document and had been retained. I have not been able to learn what became of it. Ashford gave the core sample to the recovery team. He expected it to be sent for independent laboratory assessment. 3 months later, he received a letter from the company stating that the sample had been assessed by their geological consultants and was determined to be mineralized plant material of no unusual significance and had been disposed of as part of routine sample management. Ashford wrote back twice, requesting the consultant's name and assessment methodology. He received no response. His last letter to me was in June of 1965. He did not mention Camp 7 in it. I do not know whether that means he had stopped pursuing the matter or had decided not to put such things in writing. Vince Callan signed his non-disclosure agreement and moved to Nelson. I have spoken to him twice since the events, and he will not discuss Camp 7. He is still drilling, as far as I know. I do not believe he has been underground since. The company officially attributed the closure of Camp 7 to structural instability in the shaft infrastructure and adverse ground conditions. This is not false exactly. The shaft housing did collapse. The ground conditions were adverse. Gerald Mackay is listed in company records as having gone missing in circumstances related to the shaft collapse. His family received the company's compensation package. I attended his memorial service in Winnipeg in March of 1962. I did not speak to his family at length, because I did not know what to say that was both honest and humane, and the document I had signed created a specific legal problem with honesty. I am speaking now because the document is 12 years old, and because I am 57, and because Gerald Mackay kept a notebook with what we observed written down in pencil, and that notebook is in a company file somewhere, and someone should know what was in it, even if I can only tell you what I remember. The reflection. The pulse comes back sometimes. Not often. Not on any schedule I can predict. I will be asleep and I will wake. And before I am fully awake, I am already reaching with my feet toward the floor, taking the reading, feeling through the wood and the concrete beneath whether the rhythm is there. Most nights it is not. On the nights it is, I sit in the kitchen until it stops. I keep my feet flat on the floor and I count the intervals. 4 seconds, sometimes 5, sometimes 3, never the doubled tempo of the last night at Camp 7. Just the original pulse, slow and even, as though something very large is breathing in sleep at a depth I cannot determine. I do not know what to conclude from this. I know what the pulse felt like at Camp 7, transmitted through permafrost and basalt, and 400 meters of rock, and up through a concrete foundation into the soles of my boots. I know it had a source. I know the source was deliberate in its actions, and large in its scale, and very old in its presence. Whatever had been below that void had been below it for a long time, before we drilled through it, and when we broke through, it came up. Gerald sealed those blast doors. Whatever is below Camp 7 is still below Camp 7, on the other side of what Gerald left us when he stayed in that access room. A man who has worked in deep rock understands the importance of what you leave behind you when you come back up. I think about the core sample, the claw fragment in that rock. Something of that size left a piece of itself in the stone around it thousands of years ago, and we pulled it up and held it in our hands and did not understand what we were being told. The rock had kept the record. We did not know how to read it until it was too late to be cautious. I have no particular conclusion to offer, Mrs. Rourke. I lived. Gerald did not. The doors are sealed, and the camp is empty, and whatever was in those tunnels is still in them. I put my feet on the floor in the dark sometimes and feel whether the pulse is there, and when it is, I sit in my kitchen and I wait for it to stop. And it does stop, and I go back to sleep, but I keep my feet near the floor.